Greetings. I'm Michael Quinn Patton, coming to you today to talk about transformation, what it is, how to do it, and how to evaluate it. Transformation has become the clarion call of our time, transforming systems. I've had the opportunity to study transformative social movements with colleagues Francis Wesley and Brenda Zimmerman in a book we did together called Getting to Maybe: How the World Has Changed. I draw on that and over 50 years experience as an evaluator looking at change efforts to share with you my thoughts on what it means to engage in transformation. There are good things happening in the world and there are bad things happening in the world. We know that the climate is deteriorating and that there are people working to mitigate climate change. Our job as evaluators is to look at the good news and the bad news and to try to find some balance in what's going on. Transformation is going on all around us. The natural world is transforming. The social world is transforming. The political and economic worlds are all in transformation. Transformational change intentionally by people with shared values trying to bring about a world that is more equitable and sustainable is the focus of the transformation I'll be talking about. And I'll suggest that evaluating transformation requires transforming evaluation. And we'll look at the transformations not only in evaluation, but in thinking generally about how to bring about change. We'll be talking about systems thinking, transformation moving from thinking about projects and putting initiatives into narrow silos to systems transformation, what that means, how to do it, and how to evaluate it. So let me begin with the evolution of evaluation itself, which reflects the evolution in how we plan and implement initiatives of all kinds. We began 50 years ago thinking it was all about identifying goals and measuring goal attainment. And as evaluators went out to begin measuring goal attainment, we found out that the goals themselves needed work. They often weren't well formed. They were fuzzy. They were vague. They weren't measurable. They weren't specific. And so evaluation moved from being a back-end activity, did you meet your goals, to a front-end activity, helping articulate goals. And from there, we got involved in helping identify programs themselves with logic models, moved into theories of change, and now into theories of transformation. And so from an evaluator perspective, this isn't just about assessing whether or not a theory of transformation brings about systems change. It is that evaluators are involved in conceptualizing what transformation means as a part of the engagement process and to fulfill our responsibilities as evaluators. Much of what I'll be talking about comes from the work I've been doing on blue marble evaluation and transformation globally. Blue marble being a reference to the Earth as seen from outer space on the moonshots and our global challenges, thinking globally while acting locally. And so that's part of transformation. And so this trajectory from goal attainment through logic models to theory of change and now the theory of transformation is where we're going to pick up the story. The theory of change work really was instigated by and inspired by Carol Weiss, one of our great pioneers of evaluation, who is part of a Aspen Institute seminar on anti-poverty and community organizing programs in 1995. And as she listened to the proposals coming forth from philanthropic foundations and community groups and nonprofits, she made an insightful and impassioned plea for people to base their initiatives on evidence, on research, on knowledge, on theories of change. She found that smart, well-intentioned people were sitting around making up interventions without knowing what the research says about how the world works and how the world is changed. And she wrote an article called Nothing is Practical as a Good Theory as a part of that Aspen Institute that these days we would say went viral. She put the notion of theory of change on the map. And that notion was aimed really at developing quite specific projects and programs to bring about community change, to work with the whole variety of kind of things that we do, early childhood education, health programs, anti-poverty programs, training efforts of all kinds, that they should be based on theories of change. And theory-driven evaluation emerged as a part of that. As we move into theories of transformation, what I'm going to argue is that the nature of large-scale systems change is sufficiently complex that no single theory of change can do it justice, and that what a theory of transformation consists of is multiple theories of change that are aligned and integrated. And that's the path we're going to take. We have excellent resources in evaluation on doing program theory, the purposeful program theory, the effective use of theories of change and logic models, a book by Sue Fennell and Patricia Rogers. And that work is well established in evaluation now. But what we're called on to do is to take our game to the next level and deal not with just program theories of change, but systems theories of transformation. And that's where we're going to focus our work together. The Earth is in difficulty. Humanity is in difficulty as we face the challenges going forward. And as we draw lessons about how to transform systems for greater equity and sustainability, we can draw on both our understanding of what's been happening globally, the pandemic that has so affected and changed our understanding of our global interconnections, and highlighted health inequities and disparities, both globally and within the industrialized countries. And we've moved into what's now being called the Anthropocene, a new geologic era in which humans are having more impact upon the Earth than natural Earth processes. The Earth is an ongoing transformation process naturally, but humans in the last million years, especially the last 5,000 years and especially the last 200 years, have changed the Earth in ways that exceed what the natural evolutionary processes have brought about change in. And those changes are what's feeding the climate emergency and the other challenges that make it urgent to achieve transformation of systems. We are in what's being called the sixth extinction, losing biodiversity, losing species at a massive level. And our own future is threatened as human beings on Earth. And so the world has adopted a transformative agenda, the Agenda 2030, that the world's nations signed on to. No one left behind, dealing with poverty, with health, with pollution, with economic justice, with gender equity, with sustainable agriculture and food production that is feeding the hungry and maintaining the sustainability of land. The transformative agenda requires systems transformation and systems transformation evaluation. We know that the most affected by the negative effects of climate change, the pandemic, food insecurity are children. This report by UNICEF of the impact of climate change on children highlighted that in every crisis, children are the most vulnerable, and children is no exception. And escalating droughts, flooding, degrade food production, children bear the greatest burden of hunger and malnutrition. As temperatures increase, together with water scarcity and air pollution, children will feel the deadliest impact of waterborne diseases and dangerous respiratory conditions. As more extreme weather events expand the number of emergencies and humanitarian crises, children will pay the higher price. And so the UNICEF report emphasizes not only that children will bear the brunt of climate change, but the climate change is already making existing inequities even worse, as has the pandemic, throwing millions more into food insecurity and poverty in just the early part of 2020 to 2022. And so transformation forums have grown up around the Sustainable Development Goals, where transformation involves redefinition of goals from producing energy to producing sustainable energy, of having a more sustainable and equitable future. We draw lessons then about transformation going forward from the past. Things like the end of colonialism, the end of slavery, the end of apartheid. We can learn lessons about the massive kinds of changes that went on with those transitions. And it has to happen even more quickly now because of the urgency of the climate deterioration that we're experiencing. Anti-smoking campaigns worldwide give us lessons about what works. The Me Too movement, working against sexual harassment, efforts at gender equity. The pushback of the HIV/AIDS epidemic worldwide has given us lessons about how to bring about transformation. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is an example of a movement that spread around the world to reduce deaths from drunk driving and to change how we view drunkenness. Muhammad Yunus's program on small loans to women, to make available capital to people around the world, for which he won the Nobel Prize, is an example of a transformation in capital markets that has had a worldwide impact. And so we have examples to draw on about what transformation means, how it occurs, and how to make sense of it and track it, and indeed evaluate it. So that's the framing for this. What I'm going to do is present from my perspective what it means to bring about systems transformation and how it occurs, and a framework then to use both in designing transformative innovations and interventions and evaluate them. We're talking about the dimensions of transformation that include major developmental challenges being addressed like poverty, equity, and climate change, so that the relevance of the transformation is that it's big scale, it's major, it's immediate. The depth of change, talking about fundamental changes in systems and markets, addressing root causes. Scale of change, large-scale impacts at a national and global level, and the scaling up of approaches and innovations of replication, and sustainability, economically, financially, and environmentally. These are criteria that the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank has put forth on multiple theories of change, aligns and integrates, synchronizes those theories of change to create critical mass tipping points that can bring about fundamental transformation. And that's what this diagram illustrates that I'm going to take you through. You see transformation theory there in the center, and what we're going to look at are the contributing kinds of theories of change that help support that transformation theory. This is meant as an illustration. The precise theories of change you may use in your own work will depend upon your knowledge base, your allies, the things you're working on. So this is meant to illustrate the nature of a transformation theory, not necessarily the specifics of a transformation theory that you would use. It's illustrating the integration of different perspectives. And so we begin with integrating systems thinking as a core piece. You see that around the center of the transformation theory is systems thinking, learning theory, strategic alignment theory, complexity theory, and I'll talk about each of those and then go to the outer circle, triangulated social change theory, integration theory, fidelity theory, iceberg theory, developmental evaluation theory. But we're going to begin with systems thinking because we're talking about transforming systems. Systems then involve being able to identify what it is that we're actually dealing with, the boundaries of the system, the perspectives that define the system, because systems are socially constructed. They're something we humans imagine and make sense of. They don't exist in the real world. We create boundaries around phenomena and call them a system. And that becomes real in our understanding of how the world works. They're made up of interrelationships. And so as we look at the interrelationships within a system, the perspectives, the boundaries, and the dynamics of those interrelationships and the interconnections that characterize a system, we're coming to think in systems terms. We live in this post-normal world of the pandemic in which we've seen the interconnections among different aspects of the health system, and to understand that it's not just about a disease or a virus, but it's about the entire health system, the way in which people have access to things like vaccines, the way in which viruses spread, the technologies involved, as simple as mask wearing and social distancing to hospital ventilators, the unequitable distribution of those technologies, of health-trained people, nurses and doctors, the availability of clinics, the availability of vaccines, disparities around the world. All of those have given us insights into the health system, not just health problems, but a health system. The climate emergency has given us an understanding that we're dealing with systems of production that create CO2 gases and methane and contribute to global warming. That it's not enough to take on one or more problems, but that we're having to change our consumption systems of fossil fuels, our agricultural production systems that generate a great deal of methane, and that these are system level changes, that the combination of this means we are the first generation to know that we are destroying the planet and the last generation that can do anything about it. A quote from Tanya Steele of the World Wildlife Federation. And so as we engage with systems thinking, we face this challenge, as journalist Tim Harford well put it. All we need now is a way to focus attention on a problem, climate change, that is too slow to be called a crisis and too dangerous to be called anything else. And so getting our heads around both systems and the urgency of transformation is one of the challenges. This cartoon from The Economist magazine shows the climate change standing outside a ring where the world is doing battle with the coronavirus as the next big struggle that we collectively face, as well as systems of information that include misinformation, bad information, dangerous information, in an infodemic of bad information that we are combating. The social justice uprising. I'm coming to you from Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed in 2020 and led to social justice uprisings around the world, which moved from thinking about the problems of discrimination to understanding that racism is structural, that discrimination is structural, that the oppression of people of color and of poor people, these are structural systemic issues, not simply matters of individual discrimination or individual policies, but are deeply embedded in our societal systems in different ways in different countries and in different parts of the world and the North America, but they are systemic and structural. And that's moving us toward thinking in systems. The Black Lives Matter movement, a structural racism movement, and bringing together then climate justice and racial justice for environmental justice at a systems level, so that youth become mobilized towards systems transformation. Systems thinking then is a deep part of this. I've recently have been involved in the United Nations Food Systems Summit in 2021. And the focus there was on food systems. And the language of food systems and systemic thinking was widely used, but was fairly shallow. So part of the challenge is to go deeply into appreciating this movement from thinking in terms of closed system projects and programs that reflect a command and control mentality to a complex dynamic systems perspective and the kind of transformations that involve. So what we see are complex system interactions between the coronavirus, the infodemic of misinformation, food systems, economic turbulence, the climate emergency, the environmental justice and social justice movements. These are all complex system interconnections. Systems change then means moving beyond projects to deep, broad, long-term systems transformation. One framework for that is the Water of Systems Change put out by FSG as a way of conceptualizing the elements of fundamental systems change. It begins with the story of a fish coming along one day, meeting another fish and say, "How's the water?" And the first fish stares back blankly and says, "What's water?" We often don't even know what systems we're in because we are in them, like a fish in water that doesn't know it's in water. And so they offer a framework that involves structural changes of policies, practices, and resources, relational changes about interconnections and power, all built around mental model changes, how we understand the world, our commitments to sustainability and equity that involve transformative change. These levels of policies, practices, resources, relationships, power dynamics, mental models, each involves a theory of change about changing policies, theories of change about how we change practices of practitioners, of institutions, coalitions, and networks, resource flow, economic and financial theories of change, relationships and connections around culture and institutional connections, theories of change around power dynamics and paradigm shifts, how we change attitudes and understandings and educate people. These are different theories of change that are needed together to bring about fundamental transformation. And the alignment of these different efforts by different people beginning to coalesce and support each other is part of the basis of systems transformation. The great management guru Peter Drucker said, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic." And yesterday's logic was to create projects and programs which are really closed systems aimed at clear, specific, and measurable SMART goals with a linear logic model. Systems change involves a different way of thinking and understanding what's going on at the level of transformation, the integration of multiple theories of change. And that brings us then to complexity theory, which looks at the interconnections of elements in a system that are dynamic, that are emergent, nonlinear, uncertain, uncontrollable, where adaptation is necessary. And so this theme of being able to see systems differently and incorporate complexity into our thinking, moving from a command and control mentality to adapting to the turbulence of emergent nonlinearities, is a different mindset, both for designing interventions, for collaborating, for leadership, and for evaluation. From moving from plan your work and work your plan to adaptive management and systems thinking. And so with the literature that's emerged around complexity in development evaluation and developmental evaluation, which applies complexity concepts to enhance innovation and use. We're moving from the simple kinds of considerations in designing projects and programs, where we have a logic model and conduct traditional formative and summative evaluation, to a frame where there are a number of pathways that are happening, forks in the road, responses to turbulence, changes in the world around us, and that each one of those forks in the road becomes an adaptive management and developmental evaluation, a moment that we track the trajectories toward transformation, which itself is a moving target. And that's the complex dynamic world in which we live. So developmental evaluation theory is about how evaluation becomes itself dynamic under conditions where we're all having to pivot. And the pandemic emphasized and accelerated attention to developmental evaluation because every program and project, policy, government unit, businesses, private sector, public sector, philanthropic foundations, universities, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, all were having to pivot and adapt to the changes brought on by the pandemic. And the evidence is that is our future world, a future world where we're having to adapt, where we're not in control, where we're having to connect with each other and understand our interconnections and their effects upon the larger world. Which brings us then to triangulated social change theory. That for any given effort, like stopping smoking, reducing drunk driving, the end of apartheid, the changes in the Me Too movement, that you need people working in at least three arenas: education, incentives for changing behavior, and regulation. And so major transformational changes don't result just from one of these. It requires people doing education about the issues, offering incentives to change behavior, and policy regulations that at the institutional level build permanence into those changes. That means that there are people working within systems and around systems from these three different directions, dealing with both the scientific knowledge and the political engagement, as we've seen so much in the pandemic, the conflicts of following the science politically around the world and mobilizing knowledge for education, regulation, and incentives. And so transformation involves the intersections among these different realms, the political, social, cultural, and economic, where the intersection of social and cultural involves education about changing circumstances, changing challenges, the knowledge that is emerging about sustainability and equity. It means the intersection between the political and economic involves regulatory changes. The intersection between the political and the social involves value changes. The intersection between the economic and cultural involves incentives for people to act in the ways that are for the greater good, the common good. And therefore, a transformational effort and evaluators working with a transformational effort can help track what's going on in these different arenas. How are they aligning? How are they supporting each other? Where do they conflict? What are the trajectories that begin to align and coalesce to create critical mass in changing and transforming systems? Mothers Against Drunk Driving, again, being an example where there were educational efforts to change our understanding of drunkenness. When I was growing up, all the comedians were drunks. Drunkenness was considered funny. We had to change how we think about drunkenness. It's not funny, it's dangerous. It does harm to the individuals who are drunk and to their families and communities. We had to change regulations around drunk driving. We had to create incentives through insurance programs and car insurance and institutional liability to create critical mass between education, regulation, and incentives to significantly reduce drunk driving and drunk driving deaths. The Me Too movement has likewise involved education, regulation, incentives, individually and institutionally, to collectively begin to shift those traditional oppressive actions and harassing actions by men toward women around the world. Learning theory becomes another entree into transformation, where we're involved not just in single loop learning about a particular problem, but double loop learning about the origins of problems, and triple loop learning, which involves learning about the systemic nature of problems. In this diagram from the Tamarack Institute in Canada, they show that simple single loop learning looks at simple problem definitions and solutions like a recipe, that double loop learning, asking the question, are we doing the right things, looks at complicated issues, and that when we move to complexity, with a metaphor like raising a child, we're dealing with the triple loop question, how do we decide what's the right thing to do? Single loop question, are we doing things right? Are we effective? Double loop learning, are we doing the right things? Triple loop learning, how do we decide what's the right thing to do? And part of that right thing to do is a situational analysis that's based on values and principles about who are allies working in their own arena towards transformational change that we can gather together and align to accelerate the momentum of those changes. Integration theory has to do with how disparate aspects of change fit together, so that much of our change is siloed in projects and in programs that are self-contained. And getting beyond those silos means, for example, not just looking at individual sustainable development goals, but looking at their interconnection, at how they operate as a whole, at their integral interrelationships. That brings systems and complexity thinking into integrating our understanding of how the SDGs affect each other. And transformation occurs where those interconnections are becoming accelerated. In the Blue Marble framing, we talk about global systems thinking to understand what's happening globally, but in the local context. The mantra is to think globally, act locally and globally, and evaluate the interactions. What's called glocal thinking. Combination of the word global and local is glocal. The intersection of global and local is part of transformational change, transformative thinking, transformative planning, implementation, and evaluation, of integrating global knowledge with local and indigenous knowledge for new pathways of trajectory. Zooming out then for the big picture and zooming in on our immediate context through the connections that we make around problems. Being able to look long-term, medium-term, and short-term and integrate these different perspectives in trajectories of transformation. Which brings us to another framing in transformation theory, the iceberg theory. There are lots of versions of iceberg theories. The one I want to emphasize is that much of what we look at is the top of the iceberg, where there are formal activities, explicit programs, with things that we know are going on. But what iceberg theory tells us to do is to look beneath what's visible at the informal relational things, the underlying structures and processes that drive patterns and trends, which lead to population level outcomes that we can see, that we get beneath the surface, literally, of what's happening informally, not just in official government reports, not just in official government relationships, but the interconnections between business leaders and government leaders, the private sector, investment flows, how people know each other, what informal understandings they have. That's part of where transformation occurs, not just in the explicit formal agreements, but in the behind-the-scenes relationships that go on, and making those transparent, making them accountable. That means looking at how networks can engage with underlying structures, identify those patterns to support population-level changes, and mobilizing that beneath the surface action toward transformation. Strategic alignment theory, like integration theory, is a way of looking at how different players fit together. The Stanford Social Innovation Review had an article on worldly strategy for the global climate by Henry Mintzberg and colleagues, in which they compared systems where the private sector, public sector, and nonprofit sectors were operating in conflict, going in different directions, versus where they were going in the same direction, where they're in colliding and in conflict. They found what they called a downward spiral of counterproductive activity results when sectors are cross purposes. By contrast, an ascending spiral of constructive activity toward transformation results when private, public sectors, the nonprofit sector, are aligned and integrated. And getting that alignment is a part of strategic connections together in a network theory of transformation, again derived from historical examples. Professor Gerald Haig, who was my doctoral advisor many, many years ago in graduate school, is director of the Center for Innovation at the University of Maryland and has just written a book that includes a transformation hypothesis about the role of interconnections and networks in bringing about major change. This builds on a distinguished career of publishing by Dr. Haig in restoring the innovative age, in looking at innovation, science, and institutional change. He talks about postmodern minds. This harkens back to the mindset part of the water systems metaphor. Postmodern minds implies a set of skills that he thinks are necessary for transformation to work. That includes being able to think in terms of complex dynamic systems and to engage behaviorally in network activity. In their book on organizations working together, Alter and Haig open with this observation. New mechanisms for coordinating and controlling different sectors of the economy are emerging. And it is the systemic network that offers the greatest competitive advantage in the global economy. Systemic networks, clusters of organizations that make decisions jointly and integrate their efforts to produce a product or service, adjust more rapidly to changing technologies and market conditions, develop new products and services in a shorter time period, and provide more creative solutions in the process. They predict that the interorganizational networks are the future institution, that this new institutional form will increasingly replace both markets and hierarchies as a governance mechanism, and that networks are as fundamentally different as were the multi-division corporation and its predecessor, the large bureaucracy. They conclude as follows. By concentrating attention on a discrete problem, such as global warming, acid rain, or the ozone layer, the world can move into a new stage of history. In this stage, the importance of single nations declines, just as the importance of single corporations and agencies has declined, as networks become the dominant institutional arrangement for producing products and providing services and bringing about transformation. Haig's overarching finding about generating innovation is expressed as what he calls a narrative equation, that knowledge sharing through a diversity of paradigms plus cross-fertilized collective learning equals innovation and new knowledge based in networks. In his latest book, Knowledge Evolution and Societal Transformations, which views the large scope of history through political, economic, social, and cultural technological changes to identify how transformation occurs. And the Hague transformation hypothesis boils down to this. Successful evolution and institutional transformation requires increased diversity in new technologies and skill sets that are integrated into systemic, coordinated networks. This applies both to people working to bring about change and to how evaluators have to work together to evaluate such networks. A cumulative body of research and knowledge then points to interlocking networks as the pathway to transformation in complex dynamic systems. Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point book was an early warning about understanding the importance of networks and their effects upon knowledge transfer and change. Steve Waddell, in his book on global action networks, identifies 4 trends supporting transformational networks. First, the continuing globalization, the process of developing transnational interconnectedness, socially, politically, and economically, is increasing. Globalization presents opportunities to create a much more equitable, healthy world of connections. History suggests that these opportunities have an irresistible allure. His second major trend is the inability of traditional strategies to address globalization. Quote, "We are in the midst of a global governance crisis. We need to invent new ways to approach the challenges and opportunities, and global and network action networks represent one of those inventions." Third, disruptive impact of new technologies. Our transformed ability to gather, manage, produce, and exchange goods and information must find new ways of asserting the common good. Global action networks can be an important part of the solution. And finally, shifting assumptions about the way the world works. Waddell says perhaps the most important impact of these first 3 trends is that they are changing the way we see and think about the world. These new ways of seeing and thinking about the world include the following paradigm level transitions, from addressing issues in parts to whole systems thinking, from international structures for addressing global issues to multi-stakeholder ones, from assuming the natural environment to nurturing it, from change that can be addressed by linear approaches to complex system strategies, from negotiating our way to solutions to actually envisioning futures, and from an enforcement focus to a collective value focus. Waddell concludes that global action networks are critical for bending the curve into the future in the direction of a flourishing world for all, one that is more equitable and sustainable. And so, at the core of a theory of transformation is networking people working through their own theories of change. Network theory is a theory of change that integrates multiple theories of change, like regulatory change, educational change, incentives change, political, economic, social, and cultural change, that the people and institutions and organizations involved in those various kinds of change network together to create momentum and accelerated trajectories toward transformation. An example of this is the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. The Global Alliance is a network of more than 30 philanthropic foundations on 4 continents, and Ruth Richardson, the executive director based in Toronto, has said, quote, "We believe that transformational change requires that we craft new and better solutions at all scales through a systems-level approach and deep collaboration between philanthropy, researchers, grassroots movements, the private sector, farmers and food system workers, indigenous peoples, government, and policymakers. Transformation means realizing healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, and culturally diverse food systems shared by people, communities, and their institutions." And so under the leadership of Ruth Richardson and her steering committee, they used the Hague hypothesis to generate a theory of transformation. They worked together toward a shared vision of transforming food systems that, based upon their strategy of forging new insights and strengthening evidence for global systems change, convening key food systems actors to facilitate meaningful dialogue and strengthen interconnections, and stimulate local and global action and interaction for transformational change in collaboration with other committed stakeholders to realize healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, and culturally diverse food systems gave rise then to a theory of transformation. It begins by creating, nurturing, and sustaining an alliance of diverse foundations that includes diverse people, perspective, and resources who share a common vision and strategy. That's the integrated diversity part of Haig's transformational hypothesis. These diverse perspectives and people connect and engage with other networks, collaborations, alliances, and movements committed to and engaging in transforming diverse systems. Strong connection. That leads to supporting and facilitating convergence of multiple diverse networks and initiatives around shared values, principles, and strong local actions related to transforming global food systems, which helps coordinate and integrate networked actions systemically toward transformation and leads to sustainable transformation from the integration of diverse multi-level cross-system strong connections and coordinated systemic action. The narrative theory then, in summary, says, given that successful and sustainable transformation follows from the integrated strategic action of diverse, multi-level, cross-system strong connections and coordinated systemic action, any given alliance aimed at global systems change must be organized and engaged as a committed alliance of diverse change makers that share a vision of and principles guiding work toward global systems transformation. Such an alliance strategically creates, supports, participates in, and catalyzes, as appropriate and possible, networks and initiatives of these diverse people, organizations, perspectives, networks, and resources. This calls for synchronizing and integrating and aligning many different efforts at different levels and different places to create transformational trajectories. Such multiple intersecting alliances and collaborations can convene and facilitate convergence around shared values and strong niche-specific actions, people working in their own neighborhoods, thereby supporting and enhancing coordinated and integrated actions across networks, ensuring through evaluation, learning, and adaptation that those actions are systemically and systematically geared toward resiliently sustainable transformation of targeted global systems. In summary, the Global Alliance theory of transformation that they adopted states genuine food systems transformation takes place when diverse actions, networks, and individuals intersect across sector and issue silos, the global and the local, the macro and the micro. These intersections facilitate convergence around shared visions and values and ultimately build critical mass and momentum behind tipping points that lead to healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, and culturally diverse food systems that dynamically endure over time. The evaluation role in this is to track those social system changes, those networks and interconnections, provide feedback about where the gaps are, where the momentum and energy is, using principles-focused developmental evaluation with timely feedback to help support that alignment. The networks then that connect globally can bring about transformational change, as they have with the examples I've given of the end of apartheid or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the pushback of the AIDS epidemic, the worldwide effort to reduce smoking. With the end of apartheid, there were people within South Africa working and collaborating around changing regulations, educating people, changing incentives, changing relationships, dealing with the turbulence of that oppression. And outside institutions, financial institutions, universities, philanthropies, corporations, sports, collaborating to put pressure on the internal dynamics of South Africa. And that combination of internal and external, cross sectors at different scales, people working within their own arenas in common vision of ending apartheid brought about that transformation. That's what we've learned about how transformation occurs. And so the transformation theory draws on system thinking, complexity theory, learning theory, strategic alignment theory. It draws on triangulated social change theory, which involves education, regulations, and incentives, integration theory of how to bring together different people and players and organizations in strategic alignment, looking at the iceberg theory of both what's seen and formal and institutional and what's below the surface, informal and relational, and fidelity theory, which is about walking the talk of transformation, the extent to which the realities of transformational change initiatives match transformational aspirations and rhetoric. That is, the evaluation issue here is ensuring that what's called transformation actually constitutes transformation. Evaluate whether and how what is called transformational engagement constitutes a trajectory toward transformation. We're in an era where there's a lot of what's called greenwashing, a play on the word whitewashing, where people are using the language of transformation, corporations and governments, but are really engaged in business as usual. And so the seriousness of the issue is such that we have to look beyond the rhetoric of transformation to the behaviors. Do the actions toward transformation match the rhetoric? Or are we involved in transformation glossing, simply giving the appearance of transformation? Are each of us, are our organizations and institutions and networks walking the talk of bringing about transformational change? That's an example of an integrated theory of transformation. It's meant to illustrate, not be definitive, but it's meant to illustrate multiple theories of change coming together around a theory of transformation. And these different theories of change inform different parts of the transformational process. As I said, the United Nations Food Systems Summit gave rise to a theory of transformation of food systems that involved mobilizing and engaging people, conceptualizing and implementing solutions, achieving enabling results, food systems impact. I've done a separate video on the theory of transformation for food systems that you can have a look at to see how this operates in a actual detailed case. We identified 22 different themes that came out of the independent dialogues, more than 1,000 of them involving some 40,000 people. And those 22 different factors related to food systems each constitutes a theory of change that needed together becomes a theory of transformation. And that's what that other video will take you through, how to move from the specific elements of a theory of change into a theory of transformation. You can add your own favorite theory of change to the mix as a part of generating a theory of transformation. You might add the theories on achieving excellence from Jim Collins' work that is well known, Good to Great and Great by Choice, how organizations adapt to turbulent environments and achieve greatness through leadership and collaboration. Or behavioral finance, the work on incentives, the real world incentives represented by what's called freakonomics and super freakonomics, or classic work on diffusion of innovations from Everett Rogers, the work of Daniel Kahneman, for which he won the Nobel Prize, about the ways in which we make decisions, and the way our brain operates and the nature of noise and interference with decision making, the ways in which we avoid loss in our efforts to bring about change, and fear loss and fear failure. Ways of overcoming that represents part of theories of change. How to scale changes, a large literature on that. So there are lots of sources for individual theories of change. And what I'm suggesting is, instead of searching for the definitive theory of change that would guide your transformation efforts, what we need are multiple theories of change with multiple players integrating those with evaluation. The nature of system transformation, we've learned, is that it is emergent. It happens because of the essential actions of many diverse actors, often moving in the same direction, but without a shared formal plan. It's networked. It's integrated informally. It's cross-scale. It occurs across multiple distinct yet interdependent scales, the micro-personal to the macro-global. It's nonlinear and unpredictable. It is difficult to know what changes of what magnitude will happen and how, and that little things can lead to tipping points, and enormous effort can lead to almost nothing at all. That's the nature of nonlinearity. It's cumulative, results in a series of small and big transformative moments take place over time and accumulate, aggregate towards transformation. We don't know in advance when it's going to occur, a tipping point or critical mass. We only know after the fact, but we work those trajectories toward that shared vision. Transformation will lead to resistance as the transformational trajectories begin to threaten those who benefit from the current systems of inequity and non-sustainability, when they begin to threaten the status quo, which is reinforced by actors with vested interests and power in the status quo, as well as simple fear of change. And finally, there's a splatter of effects through transformation. There's a wide range of intended effects and intended actors, which are judged good, bad, mixed by various stakeholders. And part of what evaluators help do is sort out what those are, how they fit together, what we can learn from them to feed those pieces of knowledge back into the transformational trajectories. Transformation is ultimately open-ended. Transform situations, societies, and ecosystems. It's not a destination. We don't arrive at having achieved transformation. It is an ongoing process of learning and adaptation. So the challenge is to determine where you will make your difference, both personally, organizationally, institutionally, and evaluatively. What will you contribute to transformation? Recognizing our interdependence in this global world, that we need to come together across our different skill sets, people designing and acting on change, working towards transformation, and evaluators supporting through shared values of equity and sustainability those efforts. We move toward what is called in Southern Africa Ubuntu, our shared humanity. As Bishop Desmond Tutu said, "My humanity is caught up and is inextricably bound up in yours. I'm human because I belong." The principle of Ubuntu means wholeness. It is knowledge that we belong to a greater whole and are diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they were less than who they are. Our purpose is social and communal harmony and well-being, and in this current time, that means transforming systems. And so, for evaluators, this invites different criteria to evaluate transformation, and in a separate video, I will offer transformational criteria to deal with transformational change. The professional evaluation associations are providing workshops, conferences, and writings about evaluation for transformational change. This is a publication for the International Development Evaluation Association, available free for download online. And it's one example of evaluators coming together to make their contribution to transformation. My own trajectory from utilization-focused evaluation through developmental evaluation, principles-focused evaluation, and now Blue Marble evaluation, which discusses this theory of transformation, is an example of how over 50 years we're moving from a project and program mentality to a systems transformation way of thinking. And that as we do that, we are all challenged to keep up with the ways in which new ways of thinking and acting will support movement towards a more equitable and sustainable world. Thinking beyond autonomous projects and programs to major systems transformation, where evaluators help test theories of transformation, provide feedback, formulate, redefining the theory of transformation in an ongoing cycle of learning and development. This means transforming evaluation to evaluate transformation. We are in this together. We share the challenges together. And our future on the earth depends upon our being able to come together to transform systems that are indeed more sustainable and more equitable. I'm Michael Quinn Patton, and these are my reflections on how we move from a theory of change to a theory of transformation.